the very prison system itself. The entire system is built for such race and class-based oppression. Through the expansion of racialized policing and surveillance in communities of color, the prison system has enacted systematic racialized violence. More than 70% of the imprisoned population are people of color. Secondly, the prison system gets its lifeblood not from conservative backlashes to calls for racial equality, like the black codes that they talk about. Rather, it is sustained by half measures, like Proposition 47. According to Princeton professor Naomi Murakawa in the recent book, The First Civil Right, the prison system gained most of its power through the progressive legislative response to the civil rights movement. Civil rights legislators promoted an understanding of racism as personal malfunctions in an overall ethical system of justice, an understanding that Proposition 47 and Harvard also subscribe to. This account makes the problem of racism seem like an individual issue and reduces it to merely a few deviant administrators or abnormal white supremacists, mystifying the structure whose entire purpose from the outset was racialized domination. For example, the Safe Streets Act of 1968, professing to create a more just law and order system and protect black folk from riots, actually ended up providing the very same funds for the tanks that were used by the New Orleans police to storm the Black Panther headquarters. Murakawa writes in her book of the dangers of reforms like Proposition 47, that the search for ways to improve the administration of justice are likely to reproduce the same monstrous outcomes. Administrative tinkering does not confront the damning features of the American carceral state, its scale and its racial concentration, which, when taken together, reinforce and raise African American vulnerability to premature death. Third, Proposition 47 doesn't represent the strategy of decarceration, but rather what Heather Thompson calls the decarceration dodge. According to Thompson, the prison system doesn't depend upon excessive rates of imprisonment. It is at its bottom rooted in the excessive policing and profiling of very particular communities. To let the affirmative trick you into focusing on the glacial improvements in the rates of people that are physically in prison would just be letting yourself fall to a sleight of hand. To be effective, decarceration must work against the myriad of ways that the prison industrial complex supports institutionalized racism, not just the literal confines of the prison. Now I'm going to talk about some more specific issues with Proposition 47 that proves that it's the same type of failed reformism strategies that we've previously adopted. First, Proposition 47's focus on nonviolent offenders reinforces the idea that certain convictions are just and acceptable. This demonizes people of color and continuing a racialized narrative that accepts them as permanently marked as criminals. According to prison abolition organization Justice Now, there may be an opportunity in the next few years to do substantial sentencing reform, which includes groups that are excluded by this proposed law. Prop 47 can serve to relieve the political pressure for more reform, and in fact create legal obstruction to such reform rather than be another step towards it. Second, Proposition 47's focus on simply releasing prisoners is evidence of the decarceration dodge. A condition of any prisoner's resentencing is that they must be released to parole. Parole, we would argue, is just another example of the many techniques of domination that the prison industrial complex utilizes. Parole forces prisoners to live under surveillance and mandatory drug testing. Parolees live in a prisoner-like state, even though they have been freed from the literal brick and mortar confines of the prison. This racialized policing is intensified as cops are given full authority to search, detain, and destroy the lives of parolees. Third, the community reinvestment portion of Proposition 47 is not actually in support of communities of color, but rather a reinvestment in prison and police powers. While branded as community reinvestment, these funds give no actual power or authority to the community. The majority of reallocated fund money is under the control of the Board of State and Community Corrections. These track record shows that they can't be trusted. They have been given funds for community building before, and they have consistently put them towards the construction of new prisons, jails, and juvenile detention centers. The BSSC board members are, by an overwhelming majority, law enforcement officials with an interest in expanding the scope of the prison system. This is indicative of the way in which the Proposition 47 shifts around the power of the prison system, but doesn't do anything meaningful. Thank you.
cross X in the opposite.
While we clearly agree on the desirability of decarceration, I don't think you proposed a reasonable or effective strategy for achieving it. Perhaps Prop 47 isn't perfect, we'll stipulate to that. However, what ought we do in response to as you call it, a massive and structural system of racist and classist oppression?
First of all, we would argue that Proposition 47 should not have passed at all. It was in fact worse than the existing system of control because it pushed people into parole, etc. Second is that there are and have been examples of reforms taken by local organizations that have been more effective. For example, there was an Oakland organization that forced prisons to provide better health care for some of its inmates, which then meant that the prison had to close some of its operations since it overstretched the budget. Rather than finding more cost-effective ways to pursue imprisonment, we should use the budget crisis to force the closure of prisons and end the prison system altogether.
So you cast this initiative for better health care in prisons as one that's fundamentally in competition with or mutually exclusive with the desirability of Proposition 47. To my mind, they're both good ideas. Why is it a reason why Proposition 47 is not a desirable strategy?
The premise of our argument has never been that Proposition 40, or that these other reforms are the reason Proposition 47 is intrinsically bad. There are several problems with it, which we've outlined, but I could go over if you would like.
So you talk about the mystification process, the idea that Proposition 47 is nothing more than a sleight of hand. It seems to me, I don't know, a little disingenuous to say that parole and being in prison are exactly the same thing, or as you said earlier, parole is worse. If it is a limited improvement, and perhaps, you know, it is only that, why ought we not free prisoners who are currently serving 5 to 10 years for a felony drug charge and reduce it to a misdemeanor?
Yeah, I think the quote we read from Naomi Murakawa is particularly good on this. The prison industrial complex and the prison system overall gains its power and its legitimacy through so-called half measures. It's when we do things like focus on decarceration and let the overall system of racialized policing that occurs in communities every day get ignored, that the prison system gains overall more legitimacy, and we don't pursue more effective strategies that the example that I gave above says are possible.
One final question, if I may. You contend that one of the problems with Proposition 47 is that it perpetuates the belief that some convictions are justified. Is it your case then that no conviction is justified, that prisons ought not exist at all, even for violent offenders, rapists, murderers, and so forth?
Yes, we believe that the abolition of the prison system is the only ethical response to the system that's been created thus far. We think that it is more murderous, more violent, and has no authority to be in charge of detaining, imprisoning the people that it claims to prevent, and makes those problems worse.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
Great. Now introducing David Neustadt from Harvard. We'll give the second affirmative.
Who are you voting for so far, Michael? I don't know. We just had the one.
There are technical wind-created difficulties. I put it under. Thank you. All right.
Jonah, where are you landing?
Not sure we won the cross.
I don't like reforms.
Good evening.
I don't like reforms.
Good afternoon. In Massachusetts, the sun's setting. That's it. But, first, I think it's important to make it clear about what the two sides agree about. Because the POD team has made many broad statements about the criminal justice system, which we agree with.
Yes, the prison system reinforces cycles of economic degradation in the communities that it disproportionately affects, and visits a violent future on all those who are contained in a cell, which is fundamentally a condition of inhumanity. But I think that actually this can frame some of the urgency of the effects of Prop 47 on thousands of individuals' lives, each of which has suffered unjustly at the hands of the system. 3 or a 5-year sentence, for example, may sound like not a lot of time, but that's a perversion of our system that gives so many 25-year sentences or life sentences, even for things that might seem commonplace. But a 20-year-old being put in prison for that length of time was a huge portion of their life, loses out on developing skills of interacting with people freely, being able to go to the bathroom when they wish, things like dating and using new technology, often for mistakes not any more egregious than their peers, but with differently colored skin or different opportunities of class. Many, if not most, of these offenders are victims themselves, both of addiction and of childhood abuse. The civil penalties that go along with the system of our incarceration are reminiscent of the worst examples of second-class citizenship during Jim Crow. Felons can't vote or serve in a jury, and even for life, and even committing a crime with a potential penalty of felony status, even if that full sentence is not served, can restrict completely access to food, housing assistance, and other crucial social services. People arrested for a crime that they are not guilty of can languish in prison for months while they lose their job, child services take their children, and police seize their property. Reducing arrests and felony status specifically, and not necessarily the broader system, is crucial to changing these systems, which visit so much violence upon thousands of people in California daily, and also demonstrates that there are crucial nuances between convictions that matter very tangibly to people's lives and the health of communities. The easy analogy to retrenchments of racial divisions after the civil rights movement that the Khan brings up, I think actually cuts against the Khan's case and not ours. In any policy concern, of course, there are questions of ideology that will go unaddressed. The 1964 civil rights movement was not meant to be and was never supposed to be a cure-all for racism, but rather a remedy for specific policies of inequality that had been implemented previously. Similarly, after Prop 47, evils of violence and demonization of populations will not end. Just like in 1964, the goals of the civil rights movement were not completed. However, I think we've made good arguments as to why specifically decarceration and policies like Prop 47 today are important for achieving the kind of momentum reminiscent of movements that achieved social change in the past. There have been 3 propositions dealing with, referendums dealing with imprisonment in only the 21st century in California, and there's broad, both economic and moral justifications for reductions of big parts of our prison system that we need to take advantage of now. The Khan makes the argument that the prison system is rooted in excessive policing and profiling, but this begs the question in some way. If we undermine the ways that the prison system can profile, it can be excessive by making those forms of profiling, thank you very much, excessive, and that is now illegal, then this begs the question of what kind of prison system we would have, or we do have after Prop 47. Now obviously we don't think our job is done. We think it's a step in the right direction. I think a big piece of disagreements between us is the argument that the Khan has made that we shouldn't draw distinctions between non-violent offenders and violent offenders. Catch-all reductions in imprisonment don't take into account this important distinction which we think we should keep. And I think one thing, for example, you should keep in mind is the speed of Prop 47's decarceration. All 10,000 people that can be released from prison under resentencing have to be released within the next 3 years. There are tens and dozens of thousands of people in California's prisons in many of the conditions like solitary confinement that we've argued reform specifically can deal with and remedy, who have become, in many ways, more violent, more excluded, and with fewer skills to help them reintegrate into society. It is important to develop, before issues of catch-all decarceration, systems to allow for better prisoner re-entry into societies and better conditions in prisons themselves so they don't create more cycles of violence and more recidivism and crime after the fact. Furthermore, it is the con's burden to present an effective alternative to incarceration for violent offenders. We can know that offenders affected by Prop 47 do not pose a physical threat to others and should be released, which is not the case for violent offenders, many of whom have grown more violent, as I've said. For example, many of these people may be shifted into mental asylums where they may undergo similar treatment to the treatment they're undergoing now, or forced into mediation programs where victims may have to confront people who perpetrated their own assault, and whole systems of bureaucracies, things like parole systems, masses, other things might have to be put in place to remedy these. And based on all of those reasons, I think the urgency of Prop 47 is more important than the utopian vision of an abolitionist proposition. My time is up.
You asked the question, what are effective alternatives for violent offenders, which would seem to presume that the current way that we approach violent offenders through imprisoning them and policing them and surveilling them is effective. What evidence is there to demonstrate that the prison system reduces the uses of violence by these people?
I don't think a murderer can murder a person if they're in prison.
They can.
I guess that makes sense, but do you have evidence or any claim for why it stops the causes of these claims in the first place? I understand that maybe it would stop someone who's already committed a murder, but what evidence is there to support that it reduces the rates of murder in society overall?
I don't have evidence on hand to support that, although there has been a sort of 15-year decrease in violent crime that's unfortunately coincided with the rise of the prison population for nonviolent crime. But I think the broader answer to your question is more on whether we give a kind of social preference to people who have maybe because of situations outside of their control, but have in some way taken it upon themselves to break the social contract that we hold as just interpersonal individuals. You know, I think it's, you know, if people who are released who then reoffend or who seek revenge for justices who put them in prison or their prison conditions, these are obviously unfortunate systems that may be results of a system that we have set up ourselves, but I think it would be irresponsible to kind of put those people out on the street and say, you know, you're not our business anymore.
So you have agreed that the prison system represents an apparatus of racialized policing and control in particular communities. If that's the case, why should we free up money, like you said, to target violent offenders, etc., when those are the ones that have the longest sentence, and those are the places in which the racial disparities are the highest?
Well, I would contest your claim that sentencing is actually tied so closely to crimes like that. I think we all know how 3 strike laws can put people for something as simple as stealing a sandwich in jail for a whole bunch of time. But I think that the broader response to your question is that drug incarceration specifically and drug policing, as well as the other methods, are the ways, as I think Michael illustrated pretty well with the convict leasing system and the black codes, have specific forms of injustice that more are based on targeting of people for criminal sort of characteristics, are specifically based on things like these nonviolent practices. You know, there's no difference in drug use between black youth and white youth. Black youth are more incarcerated, whereas for violent crimes like murder and sexual assault, there's evidence of an assault that is prosecuted in court, and I think it would be better if those were more accurate, and so police resources should be spent on making sure that guilty people are accused of those crimes, not innocent people, etc.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
All right, and now for the second negative constructive speaker, John Spurlock from UC Berkeley.